Well, the question about God is the most fundamental, in some ways the most difficult, and the most fascinating question. A basic mistake that people make, and it's up and down the centuries, it's certainly true today, is thinking of God as a being, as a supreme being among many. I read someplace a theologian said, most people think of God as a kind of chap. There's you and there's me and there's God and there's you, as though he's just one reality among many. What that does is it delimits God and renders God finite. Our tradition talks about God not as a being, but as being itself. Thomas Aquinas said that God can't be placed in a genus, even the genus of being. And that's fascinating because that's the way we know things, is we say, well, what kind of thing is it? That's a microphone. I'm a human being. That's a piece of paper. I'm putting these things in a genus, right? Well, God can't be defined that way, even by the genus being. So these are all beings, right? That's the widest possible genus you can imagine. But God wouldn't fit even in that one, because God is the very source of what we mean by being. And so it's a unsettling sort of insight that God is not one thing among many, but is the sheer act of to be itself.
That's very interesting, Father. And when you say that God is being itself, how does that construct the way I think about him in terms of reason? What are the limits?
Yeah, good. In some ways, it confounds reason, because reason always wants to place things in categories. That's why reason can never, on its own, get all the way into the very nature of God. Aquinas says we can't know the essence of God in this life with our unilluminated or unelevated reason. Reason is analytical. It puts things in categories. It compares and contrasts. But see, when you move into the realm of God, you're moving into a realm where the streets have no names, as you two put it. You're in this country where things can't be named and defined and delimited, compared, contrasted. And that's why reason is to some degree confounded by God. Even as reason can approach God, come to some insight about God, but finally has to give way to a different type of knowing that we call faith.
And what can reason know of God?
Yeah, in the Catholic tradition, we say reason can know that God is. So again, Aquinas says we don't know what God is in this life anyway, but I can know that God is. Also, Thomas says, I don't know really what God is, I know what God is not. So reason can eliminate from the idea of God all those things that smack of the creaturely. So for example, I can say God is immutable. Well, what does that mean? It just means that God doesn't change in a worldly way. But see, what does it mean positively? I don't really know, because I've never experienced a thing that doesn't change. Have you? No one ever has. Our whole experience is of things that change. Therefore, what is this immutable reality? I don't know, really. I say God is eternal. All that means is God is not in time. What does that mean positively? I don't know. I've never experienced something that's not in time. Everything that I experience is conditioned by time. Even my highest ideas are. So the positive quality of that is elusive. So reason can approach God. It can say what God is not. It can say that God is. That God is. But what God is, reason is sort of confounded by that. That's why we use that word mystery around God a lot, because muein means to shut your mouth. Mute comes from that. So we say God is mysterious to reason. That will permanently be the case, because reason can't really articulate the essence of God.
Father, something that I heard that helped me think about the way to speak about God is Anselm's ontological argument, that in which nothing greater can be thought. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I can get my mind around it, but not completely.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, the ontological argument?
It really is.
Some of the greatest minds in history have loved it and have hated it, have agreed with it, have disagreed with it up and down the centuries. And to the present day, you have a whole literature around the ontological argument. Even Bertrand Russell, probably the most famous atheist of the 20th century, when he was a young man, he said he was riding his bike through the Oxford campus, and it dawned on him, the ontological argument is valid. So for a certain point in his life, he thought, it works, What I think is most interesting about it is what you just said, the way Anselm characterizes God. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Now, at first blush, that seems straightforward enough. It means God's the highest thing, right? I can think of this and something higher, something higher. Now God is that which no higher can be thought. But the more you think about that, the stranger it becomes. Because imagine now the highest possible being, the highest possible thing. That thing plus the rest of the world would be greater than that thing alone, right? So think of like one of the classical gods, Zeus. The greatest thing imaginable is mighty Zeus. But Zeus plus the other gods is greater than Zeus alone. Zeus plus the world is greater than Zeus alone, right? Therefore, Zeus, even this highest being, is not that than which something greater can be thought. The high paradox is God, the true God, plus the world is not greater than God alone. Now see, try that, put that in your mind. It's like a Zen koan. It's impossible really to grasp that. That's the whole point. The true God can't be grasped and measured in those ordinary ways. He's not a being, even the supreme being, but being itself, if you want. But see, even that language is just hinting at God. It's not something we can really get our minds around.
Father, how do you respond to a critique, say like from Feuerbach, that these conceptions of God that we have are just merely projections of our own desires or a need for wish fulfillment?
Yeah, and of course Feuerbach, you mentioned, is the founder of modern atheism, the distinctively modern form of atheism. And the new atheists writing today, the Hitchens and Dawkins and company, they all reiterate Feuerbach. Think of a great atheist such as Sigmund Freud. Freud basically adopts Feuerbach's position. Think of the most politically influential atheist of all time, Karl Marx, is fundamentally a Feuerbachian in his approach to God. So he is massively influential. And he's one of those people who has one great idea. He's a thinker who had one great idea, and it truly was a great idea, meaning very influential. And it strikes a lot of people on the atheist side today as commonsensical. Yeah, God is just a projection. I'm not immortal, but I'd love to be. I'm not all-knowing, but I'd love to be. I'm not all-powerful, but I'd love to be. And so my idealized self-understanding, I project outward, and I call it God. And so it's a wish-fulfilling fantasy. You find that precisely articulated in Freud. Just as our dreams are wish-fulfilling fantasies, religion's a waking dream. The dream I have when I'm awake, and I say, there's this wonderful world in heaven where I'll be one with God and fully realized. So it's a very influential point of view. I'd say one quick thing about it. There's a lot we could say, but one quick thing is this. Does the desire for something prove that that thing is merely a projection? So that's the argument, that I desire God so much that I invent him. Well, couldn't you say, we have a desire for food? Doesn't mean food's a fantasy. Doesn't mean food is a subjective projection. In fact, my desire for food indicates the reality of food. I have a longing for a fellowship. Doesn't prove that friendship is an illusion or a fantasy or a subjective projection. It orders me to friendship. Why can't I say that the desire for God is not a sign of God's non-existence, but precisely an indication of God's existence? That it's a desire planted in me that orders me to the reality of God, and not simply a fantasy. So I think you can very easily answer that argument with the equally likely, I would say even more likely, but at least equally likely proposal that it proves God's existence, not that it disproves God's existence.